Hi, uh, this is Sarah Aronson, and I'm here today talking with Dr. Nancy Hansen, PhD. And Dr. Hansen is an associate professor and the director of the interdisciplinary master's program in disability studies at the University of Manitoba. Nice to see you today, Nancy.
Thank you for asking me.
Okay, so we're here to discuss a bill that has just passed the House of Commons, a new bill, and this bill is called Bill C7. And the exact name of the bill, I'm not sure about the exact name, but it's an amendment to the medical assistance in dying legislation that Canada has been implementing in the last while. So, Nancy, do you want to just quickly tell us what Bill C7 is?
Bill C7 is a bill that allows for medical assistance in dying. And it's being amended now based on a request, a requirement from the Supreme Court that said the bill previous to this one was unconstitutional. And there was too many restrictions on it. And so this bill removes the restrictions and gives disabled people sort of a fast track to medical assistance in dying, which is incredibly concerning to a lot of disabled people in the country. And what is most concerning for a lot of us is that what's known about disability, what the average person knows about disability isn't really based on one-on-one dealings with disabled people. It's mainly based on cultural understandings of disability, which have historically been built around things like weakness, pain, suffering, something that needs to be corrected or cured. Whereas many disabled people, and when I say many, that's 22% of the working age population in Canada, or one in five in Manitoba, for example. We look at disability from many of us look at disability from a different perspective, a social justice perspective.
Okay, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit at this point.
Okay.
What you said was that Bill C7 is a fast track for disabled people dying. Now, from what I understand it, and I think maybe the general population who doesn't have any dealings with the disability community, who doesn't know disabled people, from that perspective, we might say it's kind of a non sequitur. Why would you say assistance in dying for someone who's suffering applies only to disabled people? Like, is it possible that Bill C7 applies to a non-disabled person at all? Is there a non-disabled person in that situation?
Oh, yes, there are. I mean, non-disabled people can have access to medical assistance in dying too. It's just that there are a lot of the parameters, the safeguards in this new legislation have been removed. So that if a person has a very limited understanding of the the daily life of a disabled person, they may equate disability with suffering and pain and just and that's not the case.
No.
There can be pain at times, and there can be difficulties at times, but when the average person is in difficulty, they're offered support services and assistance for daily living activities, right? If you're having or counseling or things like that.
So are you talking about the average person who ends up having a health condition? They get sick. Someone who ends up with cancer.
Or when somebody is feeling that their life is being difficult, they're offered counseling, they're offered support, they're offered options as opposed to um, medical assistance in dying, right?
Okay. So you're saying that the non-disabled person, if they're temporarily unwell in some way, that might make it hard to live their life.
Yeah.
Instead of suggesting to them that they might want medical assistance in dying, the systems, so you're saying like the social systems have the resources in place to help that person who might be sick for a while,
Well, there's
but
this,
not be.
yeah, there's this expectation that people can have access to supports they might need, or counseling that they might need. Whereas a lot when disabled people may be experiencing difficulty, um, usually the automatic assumption is it's because of their disability. It's not because of the other elements that impact non-disabled people's lives on a regular basis, right?
Okay, so let's say, so what you're basically, I'm just trying to get this straight. So what you're saying is that a disabled person, because they've been considered disabled in that category for their life or for many years, they like it by virtue of the fact that they've been in that category for years, there's a lack of consideration for what supports they would
Well,
need.
and there's a limited expectation as to their quality of life, right? To paraphrase a famous disabled person, she said, Stella Young, she's an Australian disability activist. She passed away a few years ago, but she said, uh, people often think that if a disabled person can roll out of bed and remember their own name, that's somewhat exceptional, because the level of expectation is set so low, and the understanding of disability as it happens on a daily basis uh, is not well understood. So it's often equated with difficulty, pain, suffering, and waiting around to die, and that's not the case at all, right?
No, okay, that's not the case at all. Um, we're talking about this whole community of people who have all these lives that no one even knows about. And I know what
Exact.
you're saying because I myself am considered to be disabled. In my situation,
Hmm.
the disability they think I have is an emotional disability as opposed to a
Right.
physical disability. But
Right.
I know what it's like when you go from being considered gifted and full of potential, and then you get unwell in some way, or something
Hmm.
happens, and suddenly no one has any expectations. They don't expect you to have a job. They don't expect you to live where you want. They don't expect you to have children, to get married, to have a
Exactly.
car. All the milestones that everyone else takes for granted when you're considered disabled, they're taken away
Eh,
from you.
or they're considered exceptional, right? If you do these things, you're considered an exceptional individual, because there's very little expectation, rather that a disabled person would do this type of thing, right?
Right.
Would have
So
a
let's
job, would get married, would go to
right.
university, take
So
on the adult activities that the average non-disabled adult takes. That's still in many sectors, it's still seen as being exceptional, as opposed to natural and
right.
expected.
Right. It's not expected anymore. So and let's talk about the nature of disability, because I studied this a few years ago. The social model of disability is a very important thing to consider, and most people don't even know that model. And under that model, there's this concept that someone has an impairment of some kind, whatever
Hmm.
that might be.
Hmm.
And it's not the impairment that causes the disability, it's the fact that society can't provide the necessary supports
Or I
for the
would
person
say
who can.
doesn't. It's not that they can't. They don't. It doesn't it doesn't naturally come to the fore. The barriers seem to be the impairment. It's not seen to be the barriers that are occurring within society itself, right?
Right.
Um, and when you look at the equity, diversity, and inclusion sort of continuum, whereas gender differences, racialized differences, differences around sexuality are naturally on that continuum, disability is not usually seen on the rights continuum, right? So it's
Right.
it's it's harder to see it's harder for the general public to perceive disability as being on the that same continuum, right?
Right, like the left, for example. The left
Or
will talk about,
yeah, or like, everybody talks about uh, racialized issues, gender issues, issues around sexuality, and that's on a rights continuum, right?
yeah,
Whereas disability issues are not seen usually on that same continuum. Uh,
no.
at, having, looking at accommodation as a human rights issue around disability, as opposed to a medicalized issue. There's still
Right.
the
So what does it mean? What does it mean when somebody's life is medicalized?
well, not necessarily their life, but their way their way of being in the world has got a lot of medicalized elements attached to it, which which the average person doesn't have. Like, in order, for example, in order for if a disabled person is, existing in the world as an adult, as a non-disabled adult would, um, to get on a bus, for example, the average person doesn't need to get a note from a doctor or a nurse to say
No.
that they qualify for transportation. To get your house cleaned, for example, you don't have to get some kind of okay from a doctor or a nurse to see that you qualify. To have different sort of tax exemptions, you don't usually have to go to a doctor to get tax exemptions, right?
So,
But
so the of a person with a disabled person is there's a gatekeeping element. They have to go to medical
exactly,
professionals. That's
exactly, a
the
highly medicalized gatekeeping element. And the thing is, a lot of individuals who are in charge of the gatekeeping don't realize how much control they have on the in the average disabled person's life, right?
right. So I'd like to talk about, since you did talk about people not understanding the experience of people with disability and equating it simply with, I hope you don't mind if I use the terms disabled and disability in
No, I
terms
don't
of
mind
like,
at all. I don't mind at
okay,
all.
okay, good. The thing is, I think the average person doesn't have an understanding of the fact that a person with a disability is just a person, and they have every bit as normal a life as and rich a life as everyone else. So to that end, one of my goals with my series of interviews is to talk about disabled people's lives,
Mhm.
and what, like, for example, you're a professor at the University of Manitoba,
Yes.
and maybe you could tell me a little bit about your life and what you've done in your life and your family and your
Mhm.
work and your interests, your hobbies, and how life goes for you.
Well, I mean, it's before COVID, when we were out and about, living life and not being in the midst of lockdown, when I would go out shopping or something like that, total strangers would come up to me and say, "Can't they fix that?" I use crutches for mobility, and total
Yeah,
strangers would come up to me and say, "Can't they fix that?" And I would
yeah,
say, "Fix what? Things are great, you know." Or other strangers would say to me, "Well, I couldn't live the way you do." And it's clear that they don't understand my life, because I have a great life. I just happen to be a four-legged woman instead of a two-legged one. And
yeah,
like, my job, for example, has enabled me to go around the world and lecture on various things. I've traveled everywhere. I have uh, a great relationship, a fantastic husband. I mean, and I love my job. How many people can actually say that? I don't sit around craving to be non-disabled, which is the standard, whatever that means, that you're supposed to live your life by. I've had a disability my entire life, which I realize is different, because most most disabled people, most disability is acquired in adulthood,
Yeah,
and most disability is invisible, as you yourself talk about. But you see, I come equipped with hardware crutches, so I have those cultural markers that are accepted as being disabled. So there's all this kind of stuff that gets projected onto me
yeah,
because people aren't comfortable with seeing that kind of difference around, right?
right,
So they project a lot of assumptions onto how they assume my life is. But
right,
I wouldn't change anything.
right. I mean, your life is your life. You have value. It doesn't,
Mhm.
um, you, here's something that always is puzzling me right now. With the COVID-19, you were talking about this in an email earlier. Under COVID, and
Mhm.
they're saying this on TV, people with more medical conditions are at the bottom of the list for intubation, for
Mhm.
ventilators. So if you got sick with COVID, you get I don't know if it's still the case now or if it's changed, but just by virtue of the fact that you have pre-existing conditions, your life is considered by doctors to be one that they shouldn't prioritize. No
Exactly.
consideration of no consideration of your contributions to society, everything you do, the people that you take care of and help, the activism that are involved in nothing. They don't even know you. It's just like you're just a
Exactly.
body.
And oftentimes when individuals come, irrespective whether it's COVID or not, when people interact with the medical profession, like when they show up at the hospital, for example, there's an assumption that, you know, well, they may be in crisis, and there's an assumption, there can be an assumption at times that their life is that crisis all the time. Whereas, no, it isn't. We're going along, living our lives and whatever, but every once in a while things happen, and you have an interaction with the medical profession at a hyper level. But when you show up there, there's very little real knowledge around disability and disability issues, and it's particularly difficult for people with communication differences, for example, to get. And there was a case this week that was covered on I believe CBC, local CBC, where uh, a gentleman was was admitted into hospital with and he need he needed his support person to be with him
Mhm.
for communication issues, and that was denied. So he's since filed a human rights complaint. I mean, this individual is very aware of his human rights, so he'll take it forward. But I mean, that's one routine example, right, where
Yeah.
assumptions are made around supports for disabled people that are
Well, it's the same.
incorrect.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing in the mental health system. Now, when you're hospitalized, you can't see anybody for 2 weeks.
Hmm.
You're in a mental health crisis. I know people, I don't want to give any details, but
Yeah.
there's people who are in the hospital here and they're struggling so much. They're in crisis. The staff doesn't know how to help anybody in
Hmm.
crisis.
Hmm.
They just hand out, pills like candy
Hmm.
sometimes. And these
Yeah.
people are in crisis. There's no counselors. There's no support people. I had to wait 2 weeks to see my husband again. And they said
Yeah.
that's because of COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I was in a crisis. I was,
Yeah.
having like PTSD attacks in my room. I was scared. I thought I was going to be hurt. I was in a
Hmm.
crisis, and they leave me in this room alone with cameras for 2 weeks, and
Yeah.
surveillance and neglect and a lack of supports is what I've routinely seen in this part of the healthcare system, and maybe it's the same in
Hmm.
other places too.
Hmm.
Other areas, other areas of healthcare probably. It's weird though, because you have to ask yourself, are there areas of healthcare where they treat people better and areas where they treat people worse and relate to disability status?
Yeah. Um, I think there are changes are coming, but they're coming very slowly, and they're led by um, the disability community themselves and well-informed allies who want to change things too, which is really important. And some of that is going on right now. It's very early stages, but it is happening. But
That's
in the meantime, we're kind of dealing with a defective system, if you want to look at it that
yes.
way.
Okay, I want to talk about how this defective system we live in has led us into this dystopian situation, this ridiculous situation where suddenly, in the midst of a pandemic, the Liberal government is shoving through this legislation on dying that specifically removes the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable,
Yeah.
opening the door to lots of situations where presumably somebody who is disabled will be seen as a good candidate for these
Hmm. Hmm.
so-called tools that I think Aaron O'Toole calls them that,
Yeah.
tools for death as opposed to supports.
Yeah. I mean, I'd much rather see as much effort being put into supports for living as access to dying. I mean, to me, ableism is so endemic, is so entrenched into day-to-day thinking around disability that uh, a lot of legislators don't even see it as problematic.
Can you give me an example? Let's do a little game, okay? I also have an acting background, so I have a theatrical game. Okay,
Okay.
so what are some of the signs? Okay, so we talk about the concept of ableism in disability studies, but most people who are ableist, I find they don't understand what they're doing. So they'll be like, "Hi, how are
Yeah.
you?" You
Yeah,
know,
it's
like
the
a voice or
yes, the
"Hi."
sing-songy voice, and there's a lot of infant there's sort of like a childlike approach to how you deal with a person with a disability, right?
Right.
And it's and so you spend a lot of time uh, putting people at ease so you can go about and do your daily business, right? So you have to sort of manage the situation to make people more comfortable with you so you can go about and do your thing,
So
right?
they belittle you, they make fun of you with their tone of voice and their words, and
Well,
it's
they
your job to make them respect you.
well, it's not even that, right? They don't even realize that they're doing it. There's no, there's, it's their it's their discomfort that they're projecting onto you, right? And it's because of their limited exposure to the reality of disability, right?
Right.
And because there's a lot of assumptions built in around what disability is, and more important, what it isn't, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, for example, people are really uncomfortable with some of the hardware that physically disabled people have to use on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Like, for example, uh, a feeding tube. I know a lot of people tubes on a regular basis, and it's no big thing. It's like lunch and dinner, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, there's very little imagination, excuse me, as
Yeah.
to how how bodies work and what they're supposed to do. There's a very little knowledge or comfort around nonconformist bodies, for example, such as mine,
Yeah.
and we society tends to uh, subjectively and arbitrarily value certain forms of physicality or perception or uh, um, how one perceives the world, how
Yeah.
uh, certain types of being are valued over others, and it's highly subjective as to who's valued and who's not. And
So do you
you
think
know,
this lack of value towards bodies that are different is playing out in the government's insistence on passing this legislation now and on the Liberals' attitudes towards the whole issue?
I think it's a lack of understanding. Actually, it's fear because people like to think they have control over every element of their life, right? It's fear and lack of knowledge. What's going to help is education, right?
Okay, and are you afraid though that with the passage of this law, there are going to be people in the disability community that are pressured into assisted death?
Uh, it it might happen. I it
Yeah.
could happen. Uh, um, I I'm very concerned that inclusion doesn't mean, inclusion for me doesn't mean a faster way to die. Inclusion for me means supports to live. And it flies in the face of a lot of what the government has done to improve, to introduce legislation to improve the lives of disabled people in this country, right? There's the accessibility legislation that's being developed. There is uh, the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People that Canada is a signatory to, right? So there's all these positive things, and the way Bill C7 is being approached is kind of a polar opposite to that in many ways. I would, like many people in the disability community say, give me the assistance to live, not the assistance to die, please, because I want to live my life. Recently in Maclean's magazine, there was a, a, a an article on poverty, for example, where disabled people were living so far below the poverty line, as many disabled people do, because of the barriers that we've talked about earlier, is that they were considering medical assistance in dying so they wouldn't have to live in poverty anymore. And to me, that's a very stark choice.
Yeah, that's pretty scary, actually. Um, okay, so what kind of supports do disabled people need in order to live the full life, live full lives?
A guaranteed annual income. Anybody living in poverty needs a guaranteed annual income to enable them to have um, more access to the things we need to live on a daily basis, right? Also, um, uh, social supports like counseling if necessary, um, supports for living, um, basic things like that. Um, more, more, more stricter guidelines uh, for making things, making programs, services, and buildings more accessible, right? And
Mhm.
penalties for non-compliance. Right now, there are no penalties for, or very few penalties for non-compliance to existing legislation, right? So if, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What did you want
Oh
to?
no, that's okay. Yeah, I was just going to ask you. So somebody watching this, presumably the technology works okay, and everyone can actually watch this properly. Um, would you say, like, what would you suggest to anybody who wants to either learn more about this issue, or they want to, talk to their politicians because they're concerned about this law? What would you suggest that a person do?
I would say start asking questions, get familiar with the legislation, talk to, get in touch with disability legislation organizations across the country. Uh, the Canadian Association for Community Living, for example, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities is another example, and
Okay. Just
uh,
just hold on a second. Sorry. This end there's some noise. Someone is upset in
sure,
the background. So just
sure,
want to make sure
okay,
we don't miss things because of the background noise, or if someone's having a hard time. Okay, so you
okay,
said some of the organizations you can get in touch with are the Canadian Association for Community Living. Did you say?
yes, yes.
Okay, and what's the next one?
The Council of Canadians with with disabilities. Um, Also, I would suggest you look online at there's a UN paper that's been written about ableism in medicine, and
Ableism and Medicine. Okay.
yeah, and also uh, Dr. Catherine Frazee and Dr. Heidi Jans have
Okay.
excellent articles online regarding um, the impact of Bill C7 on disabled Canadians, and there's a campaign right now called Why Us, so hashtag
Okay.
Why Us. So you might want to check into that as well.
Great. All right. Well, so thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. It's a Saturday, so you should time out of your weekend to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was truly my pleasure. Thanks for asking.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
and it's really nice to talk to you. Have a nice rest of your, I guess, rest of COVID.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay,
Take care.
you too.